right, looking at the Eastern Front in 1914, there was a Western Front, and we're talking about France over there, Germans against the French. There's an Eastern Front also. This is Germany's Eastern Front, and it's the first year of the war, 1914. Germany was quite surprised, as I mentioned earlier, that the Russians actually got into German territory within a very short space of time, much quicker than expected in the Schlieffen Plan. In fact, two large Russian armies, got into German territory, into eastern Prussia. This is the far eastern side of Germany that borders with Russia at that time. And unfortunately for the Russians, the Germans just had meager defenses over there, but they did have Maxim guns in place and armies in place. And in this week here, August 20th to the 26th, the Russians fought two battles against German defenses, one at the Battle of Tannenberg and another at the Battle of Masurian Lakes, and the Russians got wiped out. The German defenses just chewed up these Russian armies. The statistics are about 50,000 Russian casualties in these battles as they just marched into German machine guns, and then the ones that didn't get shot up surrendered en masse. So it was a disaster for Russia. It's the first of many disasters for Russia. In fact, in World War I, when someone mentions the Russians, the next word you can say is pretty much got slaughtered. And this is the start. This is 1914. Here they are entering eastern Prussia, and then these battles around here on these lakes, these Masurian lakes, just chewed up the Russian armies. The war in the east is very different than the war in the west. The war in the east starts off with some Russian disasters here, and because this area, present-day Poland, is very flat and large, you won't see the trenches that you see on the Western Front. The Western Front's famous for its trench digging. The Eastern Front's going to be famous as a wide-open battle. Here you can see the German armies in the first year of the war with their Maxim guns and their little pointed helmets there, not digging in, but the Russians are on the run, and the Germans will be expanding pretty much from the start of this war. You also see a couple of heroes in the East, and I want to mention them to you because they're going to be in the West in a second, and I just want to mention them to you because you're going to see them later in the war. The commanding general in the East is this guy right here, Paul von Hindenburg. Perhaps that name rings a bell for you. He'll be president of Germany later on when Hitler comes around. Right now he's in the German army and winning great victories against the Russians. And then his chief of staff is a guy named Erich Ludendorff right here. And Ludendorff, really great military genius, they're figuring out some things about World War I, that the Eastern Front is a winning side, whereas the Western Front's going to be losing for the Germans. Another thing to bring up here is the Ottoman Empire. Watching what's happening all around Europe, I mentioned the Italians don't get in just yet, but the Ottoman Empire they have a different view of the war. Seeing these Russian disasters, they decide to join in with Germany to hopefully get something out of Russia, defeat Russia, their arch nemesis. And so they will actually join the Central Powers. So the Central Powers become Germany, Austria-Hungary, and now the Ottoman Empire, not Italy yet. And Italy actually will not join the Central Powers. But the Ottoman Empire does. And what's important about this is that they close the straits. Those straits we've been talking about, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the entry to the Black Sea, the Turks will close those. So this will cut off Russia. Russia has no access to the Mediterranean, and the Germans can block them up in the Baltic. So the closing of the straits basically isolates Russia in this war. Russia will be isolated and not do well in this war at all. The other thing the Turks do is they close the Suez Canal. Now this is going to have a huge impact down in Egypt, has a huge impact on the British Empire. As this war breaks out, the British throw every man they have into Belgium. They need more men, and so they start calling up from the empire, Australia, New Zealand, India, parts of South Africa, and the only way to really get to the conflict quickly is through the Suez Canal. And when the Turks decide to close this Suez Canal, that's when the British decide, that's it. It's time to do away with this Ottoman Empire, and it'll be tougher than expected. Here's the Suez Canal there, and so they'll bring the troops up the Red Sea and try to land and get the Suez Canal, and then here's the two straits right here, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles leading to the Black Sea. And so this will become very important. The Ottoman Empire becomes very important in World War I. The supposed sick man of Europe will hold on much longer than expected. They had German support, German officers, German machine guns, and the British will have a devil of a time. If you'd like to see a couple of movies about this war, there's a movie called Gallipoli, about the Australian soldiers come up to fight the Turks and getting slaughtered. And there's another movie about a guy named Lawrence of Arabia, a British officer sent to deal with the Arabs, trying to get the Arabs to rise up against the Turks. So as we go into 1915 now, the point of all this after 1914, just the disaster on a massive scale of 1914, is that by 1915 the armies are just exhausted. No one expected that kind of slaughter in just the first 5 months of 1914. August, September, October, and so on. So by 1915, the armies are just exhausted. Everyone's just kind of at a standstill. Everyone all around Europe is trying to bring in new recruits. You're having guys called up out of high school now, that the numbers are far more than ever expected, needed to win this war. Also, what you'll see back home on the home fronts is governments taking over factories. If you own a factory in one of these countries, you need to be making war goods. And so there'll be a lot of war profiteering on this, companies making a lot of money building war goods. But 1915 is a year of rearming, recuperating. And then about the Italians, Italy is seeking offers. Again, I mentioned this before, seeking offers in 1914. And by 1915, they decide to join the Entente. That this is they get the best offer here. Italy will receive from the Entente powers the Adriatic coast. Italy borders on the Adriatic, and this would be the other side of the Adriatic, the Austrian side. If all goes well and the Italians win this war, they'll receive, or should receive, the Adriatic coast from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they do. They will join the Entente powers, and we now start calling them allies, in 1915. And so those are your basic sides now. On the Entente side, Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. On the Central Power side now, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. What about the United States, you might ask? Where do we stand on this war? Where do we stand generally up to World War II? Our president at this time was Woodrow Wilson, a college professor turned president of the United States, and his quote, here's a famous quote by him as we're looking at this war: "We must remain impartial in thought as well as action." What does that mean? We will stay neutral as long as we can. As long as Woodrow Wilson can, he will stay neutral in this. This is part of American history. We are basically isolationists. We don't like being involved with Europe. And we have our Monroe Doctrine. Here's a cartoon of the time showing our Monroe Doctrine separating us from the destruction of Europe, and that's the way we like it. Europe in flames, and our hemisphere is fine, and we will hopefully make money off this deal.